On the 5th of January 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin preparing for the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation reports on the Philippines, Malaya and points south indicated that Japanese troops in a few months would be in control of East Asia and the other areas they had attacked in December, so Yamamoto told his Chief of Staff Mato Mugaki that he wanted the plans to be completed by the middle of February. The speed with which the Japanese had conquered the Western Pacific astounded the planners in Tokyo and brought about sharp disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. The ardent military nationalists wanted to press on as long as Japan was victorious, no matter how far afield such planning led. Another group represented by Admiral Yamamoto had been less than enthusiastic about the opening of war with the United States and Britain and worried about the future. One reason Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato was that friends on the Imperial General Staff had worried that if he remained in Tokyo he would be assassinated because of his public opposition to unlimited war. Even now his opinions were no secret from those around him. His Chief of Staff Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary about the need for far-sighted statesmanship following this first month of glorious victory. Those were words that Yamamoto often used in warning that Japan could not war on the Western powers and hoped to win in the long run. Yamamoto's open criticism of the politicians was aimed at Prince Kuno and others who did not seem to know what sort of war Japan should wage in the Pacific. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with a friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusudu organization at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto, warning his friend that war was inevitable because of decisions taken by the politicians, said that at first we'll have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles, and now just a month after the war had begun the octopus was spread almost flat. Yamamoto, however, had also warned his old friend that the euphoria could not last. The time, he said, for political action was the moment that Singapore fell, that disaster would unsettle the British in India and they would undoubtedly be willing to listen to talk of peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had been a member of the delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans and he had been Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 198. He agreed that once war was started by the politicians a major victory must be won quickly, but when that victory was achieved he believed Japan would have only a year and a half to bask in glory. We must get a peace agreement by then, he told Sasakawa, and he looked to this old friend to carry the word among the right-wing political leaders who were in power. On January 5 the victory seemed close at hand. The American battleship fleet had been put out of action at Pearl Harbor. On December 7 the British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off the Malay coast in the Philippines. Manila and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered at Hong Kong and Japanese forces were on their way to new landings in the Dutch East Indies at Rabaul on New Ireland, Amba and in the Solomon Islands. The attack at Pearl Harbor, however, had not accomplished all Yamamoto had hoped for. The destruction of the major elements of the United States fleet. The aircraft carriers which had been at sea were unharmed and represented a constant threat. What was needed was a spectacular achievement, and Yamamoto did not expect the fall of Singapore for 5 or 6 months. It came on February 15. He believed that if he was to achieve his goal of setting up the stage for negotiation he must move in another direction, but the question before his planners was where to strike next. The army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land and the army was heavily occupied in China and Southeast Asia, so 3 other ideas were offered. Yamamoto's favorite was to attack in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet and destroy it as Yamamoto had destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor, and then push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans who were driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Thus the Japanese Navy would be assured of all the oil it needed. The army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation, so only 2 plans were left. One, advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of that forward base of operations. After moving into the Solomon Islands the Navy would take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa. Advocates of this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already setting up occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand, but Yamamoto did not like the Australia plan because he thought it would take too long and still would not be spectacular enough to halt the Americans. Yamamoto also knew the Pearl Harbor attack had aroused the spirit of vengeance in people the Japanese had been learning to detest as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the army said, to fight a war to the finish. It was apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a victory that would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January Yamamoto ordered another plan drawn, and 2 months later sent officers to Tokyo with the document designated the MI Plan, which envisaged a battle off Midway Island where the American carrier force would be destroyed. He also sent to Tokyo the OWL Plan, which detailed the invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, Hawaii would be occupied and later perhaps the West Coast. At least victories at Midway and in the oceans would give the politicians a base for negotiating the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve in Tokyo. The admirals quarreled around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but in the end Yamamoto had his way forgotten was the potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purpose. The reason they were no longer important lay in the April raid of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The DWIII raid had shocked the Japanese into a realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight. In June, after the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, there was no time for recrimination. Indeed, the army did not even know the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 big fleet carriers was carefully suppressed so that it was known only at the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward to set up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australia. Naval forces had taken Rabaul on January 23, and from that time onward they had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It was apparent to the Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. If they were successful, it would be very nearly a walkover for the Japanese to take northern Australia. In February, the Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Salamaua, New Guinea, the pace stepped up. In May, just before the Midway battle, the Japanese sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back by the fierce defense of the Americans and Australians. In the carrier battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese did occupy Tulagi north of Guadalcanal and built a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced plan in Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for a Japanese move in the south. MacArthur told the Australian government it must be ready for an attack before a Japanese thrust that was generally expected to be made against India. He cabled General Marshall for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes, but in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until the end of June he would have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific. While on the eve of Midway, the Japanese had 10, and Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already given advanced warning about the big move he expected the Japanese to make, which turned out to be the Midway battle. While events were taking their course at Midway, the Japanese were establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tomaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salawa, and the naval troops occupied Lae and began to build up an air base there. And independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukachi Hotake was ordered to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa, and to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. That would be after the Midway battle, when Admiral Yamamoto could be expected to have returned with his combined fleet. That big carrier force was expected to protect this new move in spite of the defeat at Midway, which was reported as a victory to the forces in the field. Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans. A few days after Midway, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were ready to move. In view of the Midway victory, MacArthur suggested that the Allies make a preemptive attack on the New Britain, New Ireland area, and then an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the area, with the 2 carriers and the 1,000 planes and an amphibious division. MacArthur would force the Japanese back to True. On June 12, General Marshall offered the MacArthur plan to Admiral King with some modification. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, and 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to make the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea because it would put MacArthur in command of the fighting. King's other reasons were supplementary. The carriers would be subject to land-based attack, and they would not have enough protection. As it turned out, the Navy had to cope with both of these tactical problems. At Guadalcanal, King devised his own plan, a drive from the New Herds by forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to having his Army forces serve under the Navy, but nobody could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they took New Guinea and were poised to attack Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who was going to command the operation. They gave Phase 1 the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi and adjacent positions to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was just a spot on the map with no known tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a name in this JCS plan. General MacArthur was thrown a ASOP after Phase 1. He was to take over and mop up the Japanese in the rest of the Solomons. Rabaul in New Guinea. Admiral King was given his way because the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that King had already planned a defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan would need relatively less force than MacArthur's. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had weeded General Arnold into sending several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had reinforced Samoa and Epet in the New Herds, and he planned to put a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness at the time of the Wake Island crisis had aroused King's annoyance, was shipped off to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were told to develop new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the first effort must be to hold the line in the South Pacific while training the amphibious forces. The second stage would be a combined offensive by the United States, Australia and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth stage would take the Allied allies either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was just what he himself envisioned, and he made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gourley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and told him to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious operation. All this was done even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gourley left Washington on May 1. He would take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19, but first he had to go to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gourley got to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already beginning in the South Pacific. On May 22, an Army plane saw a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that the grass on the island's central plain had been burned off and tents had gone up in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunger. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that construction of an airfield was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew the names: the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were the equivalent of American CB units. This information was confirmed in a radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence group, which had broken parts of the Japanese naval code, picked up a message saying that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4, and fleet intelligence put 2 and 2 together. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day on his way to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner knew where he was going. It could be no place but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His task was to train a whole amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began to move ships and men around, Admiral Gourley was on his way to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gourley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy thoughts about the foolishness of trying to stage an amphibious operation when no one knew how to do it. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, agreed with him entirely. They also agreed that with the planes at hand they could not guarantee the landing sufficient air coverage. After all, this meeting occurred on July 18 and the landings were to be made in 3 weeks. They sent a dispatch back to Washington recommending that the operation be deferred, but King was not happy with that message. King had told his new commander that he was handing him a difficult job and that he would not be able to give him the proper tools until perhaps the fall. The answer was no. The invasion would proceed as planned. Now Gourley had left Washington convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom increased when he tried and failed to get CBS and other units sent immediately to New Zealand. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was notable for failures of intelligence. All concerned commands knew that an operation was in the offing, particularly after July 10 when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gourley his operations orders. The major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt that they could strike a deadly blow at the Allied buildup, but on July 10 the Allied Intelligence Service's report reaching King contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield and back at Combined Fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission would leave Rabaul on August 14 as commander of the overall United States operation. Admiral Gourley tried desperately to get more help to build advanced bases to bring in more planes, but everywhere he turned he learned the truth of Admiral King's assertion that he would not be able to provide Gourley with proper tools. The supplies of the invasion forces, for example, were loaded hodgepodge aboard the transports at Oakland. There were plenty of docks so that the ships could have been unloaded and reloaded with supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Numa, which had no such facilities, and Admiral King had at least a general idea of the difficulties, but there was not time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they got to Australia. The timetable remained. By late July the rush was on and 177,000 Marines were moving by troop ship from California, Pearl Harbor, Numa, and Samoa. Admiral Gourley was too busy to hold a conference of his commanders, but on July 28 Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was supposed to be in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time the tactical unit commanders met to talk about the invasion, and Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vander. Once the Marines had taken the island, garrison troops would be brought in, but so hastily was this operation called that no one had made provision for any troops to be held in reserve. There were no more men available in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was not a happy one. Fletcher began by announcing that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gourley's staff members at the meeting concurred, that the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher was gunshy 31 that the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who had a better idea of the global military picture than any other man in The captain that day chided his superior. There was no point in that sort of argument, he said, and the decision had been made to risk all. It was their job to carry out orders. Fletcher ought to have known all that. After Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of action that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz ascertain the condition of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz was a kindly man and he liked Fletcher. He had given the carrier commander a pep talk, and then when the Battle of Midway was won, Fletcher, who was in command there, could hardly be faulted. But on the eve of the first American offensive operation, to warn the troops and the men of the support ships that he was going to desert them in 48 hours was a most inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was staged on July 28 and lasted 3 days. The scene was Kororo Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they didn't know what to do. General Vandergrift regarded the mock-up as a complete bust, but there was no time even to second guess. On July 31 the Marines were back aboard the transports heading for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers. He would have his planes over the landing force as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were being taken as far from harm's way as possible. If American intelligence was so faulty as to permit the Japanese buildup of the airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was faultier, for as the United States invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no inkling of a forthcoming attack. In July 1942 the Japanese army was preoccupied with trying to capture New Guinea as a staging point for its operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomaro H's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Bona. After capturing Bona, the Japanese planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby. So in July, Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters swept over the piers and airfields nearly every day after the Japanese landings. The Japanese AI forces were also called on to support the beachhead, and in the early days of August their attention was fixed on the new drive. The combined Australian and American Air Force responded with raids on the Japanese airbases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored at Hashima in Japanese waters. In a leisurely fashion he was preparing for the forthcoming air operations over Australia, and he would see then what action was to be taken next. In preparation, on August 3 the naval air groups stationed at Lae were brought back to Rabaul to be ready for the Guadalcanal operations that would begin the following week. During the first week of August the South Pacific skies were cloudy and only a handful of Japanese search planes took to the skies. None of them found the American armada that was steaming toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Bua. They had been told that the United States carriers were destroyed.